So, can a listing broker receive extra compensation if the listed property is purchased by an unrepresented buyer? And that is yes. That is C2, what we're looking at here. Additional compensation to seller's broker if buyer is unrepresented. You can put whatever amount in you want in here. You're negotiating that with the seller. So having this discussion with them can help you negotiate this extra work number, essentially what this is. Maybe it's 0.5%, maybe it's 1, 2, whatever you're negotiating with the seller at that point to deal with unrepresented buyers. It's going to go on C2 here. And you have to remember that this is only that we're not talking dual agency here, where there has been some confusion with this, that you want to make sure you're being clear with your seller that this is not dual agency fee. This is unrepresented buyer fee, because if dual agency happens, you're going to need to put a compensation agreement in place with the buyer and ask for the seller to pay that compensation amount, just as if you were not a dual agent. Yeah, this is not the dual agency fee. Agency is a consensual relationship that requires mutual agreement for the agent to represent the principal. The fact that a seller is paying the listing broker extra or not for a transaction involving an unrepresented buyer does not in itself create an agency relationship between the listing brokerage and the buyer. Just because there's extra compensation doesn't mean that there's agency. Those two do not go hand in hand. Paragraph C2 is an optional paragraph and will only apply if the box in the third column is checked at the time the listing is taken. The amount that the listing broker charges if there is an unrepresented buyer is up to the seller and the listing broker to negotiate. Whether 2C2 is checked, and regardless of the amount of compensation specified in 2C2, the listing broker is still entitled to the amount of compensation specified in 2C1 for representing the seller. So this number up here, whatever you're going to have in C1 that you originally agreed to for your compensation for services of representation for the seller, that's not going to change regardless. So it would be that plus the extra work fee is what I call this. So why might a listing broker ask the seller for additional compensation if a buyer is unrepresented? Short answer is extra work and increased risk and liability. That's really what it boils down to for us as the licensees and the representative of the seller. An unrepresented buyer may likely make additional demands on the listing broker that would not be present if the buyer was represented, such as asking for forms, such as a purchase offer, allowing access to the property, interacting with escrow, title, and inspectors. All of these activities expose the listing broker to additional risk, but the listing broker may need to provide some of those services to facilitate the sale for the seller's benefit and thus fulfill the listing broker's fiduciary duty to the seller. So it's a little bit of a fine line here that you walk when you're dealing with the unrepresented buyer. And we all want to help and we all want to see the deals closed, but you really have to be mindful of the questions you're asking and the tasks you're performing. And is it a task on behalf of the seller, or are you creating agency with the buyer? So can a seller refuse to receive offers from unrepresented buyers? Yes. There's little incentive for a seller to do. The offer may be professionally prepared by an experienced investor or poorly prepared by a novice purchaser. It is most likely in the seller's best interest to receive all offers, even those from unrepresented buyers, and decide on how to respond, if at all, to such offers on their merits, including taking into account that the buyer is unrepresented. So can a listing broker provide a purchase offer form to an unrepresented buyer? This is the question that's been coming up quite a bit, actually. And the answer is yes, you can provide the purchase offer. I know that the security settings on zip forms, you can't just send them over a blank. You have to at least put in the property address. So you'll need to at least do that in order for you to send over the blank purchase offer. The car terms of use allow a broker to provide forms to any party in a transaction for which the broker is acting as an agent. The listing broker who does so should first get the permission of the seller, because again, you want to make sure that the seller's okay with what you're doing and that they are going to want to accept an offer or review an offer from an unrepresented buyer. So you do need to check and get permission of the seller, let them know what needs to happen in order for them to take a look at what this unrepresented buyer has to offer. To reduce the risk of creating an agency relationship with the buyer, the listing broker should not fill in any substantive terms or blank fields of the offer, but instead should only include the property address, the buyer's name on the form. You can also add in your brokerage information there on page 17 of the RPA, which I would definitely do, but there's not going to be anything on the buyer broker side, only on the listing brokerage side. So you will want to fill that out as usual on the purchase agreement, and then the buyer's name, and then the full property address. That should allow you to download that into a PDF and send it all over to the buyer and say, here's your offer form, get it back to me when you can. So they will need to fill that out on their own, but we can provide them with the forms. We cannot advise them on the forms though. Let's see. If a listing broker gives an unrepresented buyer a blank offer, what else should the broker do or not do? So the broker should provide that buyer with a buyer non-agency agreement. And I would send that over either prior to sending over that blank offer. That's what I would do. But at minimum, it should be included with that offer, because you want to make it so over the top clear that you are not representing these buyers in any way. I would have that signed first. And then once they sign and agree that, yes, you are not representing me, I am an unrepresented buyer, then send over the purchase package essentially blank at that point. The broker should not discuss terms or help with the unrepresented buyer complete the offer. And I know we all want to help. That's what we do as realtors. We want to help homes get sold and help buyers and sellers and get them through these transactions and everything else. But you also have to remember the risk and liability if you are not going to be actually representing them. You need to make it very clear and draw that line. If they're choosing to be unrepresented for whatever reason, unfortunately, there's going to be some pains on their side. There are some ways that we can deal with that, though, especially if maybe this is their first purchase or something like that, and they don't know how to fill out this purchase form. We can do something for them with that as well. The broker should remind the buyer that the broker is acting in capacity of a seller's broker only, with any further communications with the unrepresented buyer, and should refer the buyer to the previously provided BNA form. That's the buyer non-agency form. So these are the things that you should do. Now, let's say you provide them with the blank offer and they go ahead and write it up, and the boxes are checked. It just has the price in there. Maybe no financing is checked. It's just a mess. How do you respond to that as a listing broker? Because you can't help them out with this. So how do you respond? The offer should be evaluated on its own merits by considering the offer's terms and presentation. A relevant factor could include the fact that the buyer is unrepresented. The seller could decide to not respond at all, reject the buyer's offer. I would highly recommend to formally reject the offer in writing in the rejection spot and point that out to the buyer if this is being rejected for whatever reason. Just so it's clear with the unrepresented buyer that your offer has been presented and it's also being rejected, so they can't make any claims against you. The seller could accept the buyer's offer and they can issue a counter offer to the buyer's offer, the whole usual stuff here. If the buyer's offer is poorly written or does not contain terms approved by the seller, it may be best in the counter offer to reject the buyer's offer in its entirety and refer to and include with the counter offer a new purchase offer prepared by the listing broker on behalf of the seller with terms acceptable to the seller. So that's how you can, I guess, combat a poorly written offer from a unrepresented buyer. Again, this is the extra work fee. This is the kind of stuff that you would be getting paid extra for, and what you need to discuss with your seller at the listing appointment. It's a pretty good protocol. If there's just going to be way too many things to counter, just reject that, state it in the counter offer, you're rejecting it fully, and you're sending over an agreeable purchase agreement from the seller or on behalf of the seller. If the listing agent or another agent in the same brokerage company as the listing agent prepares an offer for the buyer, will that buyer be represented by the brokerage company? I think we know the answer to this. So if the agent for the brokerage company had previously obtained the buyer's signature on a buyer representation agreement, that's going to be BRBC and PSRA. Actually, I'd be curious, what are you using out there? Are you using more of the BRBC or are you using the PSRA? Because I personally like the PSRA with the newer clients. I don't know what everybody's preference has been since it's rolled out, and the new PSRA form, the property showing agreement. But I'd be curious to see what you guys are using. What's your preference with the buyers that you're working with? So if the buyer has not signed a buyer representation agreement, either previously or prior to or concurrently with signing the offer, then an agency, if any, will be determined by the circumstances. If the agent preparing the offer merely provides the buyer with a blank form and also provides the buyer with a non-agency agreement, and the agency confirmation paragraph in the offer identifies the listing brokerage as the seller's only agent, then agency should be avoided and the buyer will be unrepresented. However, if the agent preparing the offer discusses terms with the buyer and assists the buyer in completing the offer, then a buyer could believe implied agency, if we all remember back to when we were getting licensed and learning about agency. The agent was acting on behalf of the buyer's behalf, and the agent could be deemed to represent the buyer. So you want to make sure you're not getting into this implied agency scenario by helping them fill out the offer and things like that. Really, it's the DMV transaction. Here's the form, go fill it out and come back to us. For a refresher, implied agency definition. Implied agency is a relationship between a principal and an agent where the agent acts on behalf of the principal without a written agreement. It can be created by the actions of the parties involved or by law. So even though you're not providing the AD form or anything else, the mere action of helping the buyer fill things out and explaining things to them to hopefully make your job easier when presenting it to the seller, you're creating an applied agency, and more than likely, and now you're in an agency relationship with this buyer, and technically they're not unrepresented at that point. What would happen is essentially you're working for free at that point. The listing brokerage will then be considered dual agent in this transaction. Important: when the agent fails to obtain the buyer's signature on a buyer representation agreement, the broker and specific licensee will not be entitled to compensation from the buyer for the services rendered. The brokerage will be a gratuitous agent with the same responsibilities and liability to the buyer as a paid agent without the benefit of compensation. So the brokerage company will also not be entitled to additional compensation from the seller for having an unrepresented buyer, because technically they're not unrepresented at that point and you can't get your extra work fee. This all sounds like maybe it won't happen, but we have to be careful because these are the kind of things where lawsuits may come about more frequently, because the law can look at, were you acting as an agent or not? Did you create agency, implied agency even, with your actions with this buyer? And so you can have a dispute with your seller at that point too, with the extra work fee, because if you have a very savvy seller and they know that you're helping the buyer, preparing things for the buyer and things like that, and you go and tack on that extra work fee in an unrepresented buyer fee, they can dispute that and say, no, that wasn't an unrepresented buyer because you were creating implied agency. You helped them along, you became their agent. And unfortunately, now you're working for free as a buyer's agent and only getting paid your listing fee. So there could be a lot of scenarios that kind of come up from that. So you have to be very careful with agency now. And not that you weren't before, but now it is a little bit different. And we're going to have unrepresented buyers running around out there. And we need to know how to work with them properly so that we don't get ourselves into a situation where we're a gratuitous agent, or where we have created implied agency on accident for some reason. Yeah, that's any questions, any comments? What are you seeing out there? That's what I have for today. It's a little short today, unfortunately. I thought this was going to go a little longer, but I wanted to cover these topics, mostly the listing, working with unrepresented buyers, because we are starting to see that just a little bit more. And I've had some questions come up about working with them. What can I and can't I do as the listing broker? When am I working on behalf of the seller, and when am I creating agency with this buyer, this unrepresented buyer? I wanted to cover that today just because those questions coming in have been a little bit more frequent lately. I wanted to be pretty clear from a CAR standpoint on what they're advising on how to handle working with unrepresented buyers. I guess we'll wrap up a little early today. If there's no other questions or anything, I don't see any in the chat. I appreciate everybody coming on, especially if you are a regular and you come on every Monday. It really helps me out because then I'm not answering the same questions that we just went over, usually like on a meeting and stuff. I do really appreciate you when you join in. We had someone pop in. So Manny, open house this weekend, buyers asking questions about property. Does that create agency? If they're factual questions about the property, it doesn't, because you're working on behalf of the seller at that point. But if you start negotiating price with them and things in terms and stuff like that, then that's a little different. But if they're asking questions about the property, where does the yard end? Is it past that fence or not? Or is it over by that tree or something like that? You're still working on behalf of the seller at that point, so that would be okay to do. It's when you start basically negotiating terms and things like that with the buyer on what the sellers will and will not take as far as price and terms.